The summer sun scorched the cobblestone streets of Paris in the year 1789, casting long shadows over a restless city. The scent of sweat and fear mixed in the air as desperate cries echoed through the narrow alleys. Food was scarce, taxes were cruel, and hope was growing thinner by the hour. In the heart of the city, behind crumbling facades and shuttered windows, whispered dreams of freedom, pulsed through the blood of a people betrayed by their king. The monarchy bloated on. Privilege seemed blind to the agony of its subjects. Louis XVI sat behind the gilded walls of Versailles, insulated from the rage simmering beyond his court, spoke of reform in velvet voices, but change came slower than the march of starvation. In the bakeries, bread was a luxury in the markets. Even rotten vegetables were fought over like gold. Paris had become a pressure cooker, and the flame beneath it was revolution. In a cramped room near the Rue Saint-Antoine, a group of men and women gathered, their faces pale from hunger but burning with purpose. Among them was Camille Desmoulins, a young lawyer whose words could set the air on fire. His eyes blazed with conviction as he rose from his chair, waving a newspaper in his hand and urging the people to arms. "The king has betrayed us," he shouted. "They mean to silence our voices, but we will not be silenced, not anymore." The others nodded solemnly as fear gripped their hearts. But so did something else, a desperate longing for change. They spoke of injustice of their fathers, crushed by taxes, of their mothers dying without medicine, and of their children growing up with the shame of poverty. They knew that freedom had a price, but they also knew that silence cost even more. At the center of their plans stood a symbol of tyranny, a fortress whose name stirred both dread and defiance. The Bastille. It rose from the eastern edge of Paris, its gray stone walls looming like a monster over the district below. To the powerful, it was a prison for enemies of the crown, but to the people it was the beating heart of oppression. Stories flowed through the city of men who vanished behind its gates, of cries that never echoed back, and of letters signed in royal ink that condemned. Without trial, the Bastille was more than a building. It was a curse, a warning, and a wound. In every poor district, its silhouette haunted dreams, and in every whispered prayer for freedom, it stood as the final obstacle. On the morning of July 14th, the city awoke not to birdsong, but to the clash of iron and the thunder of boots. Crowds gathered in the squares, some shouting, some silent, but all with the same fire burning inside, armed with whatever they could find: kitchen knives, muskets rusted, swords, or just their bare hands. They marched not as rebels, but as citizens reclaiming their dignity. The Hôtel des Invalides had already been raided, and from it they had seized guns and powder, but they needed more, and they knew where it was kept. Behind the thick walls of the Bastille lay barrels of gunpowder, and with it their hope of true resistance. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard René de Launay, looked down from the ramparts with growing unease. The mob below had swelled to thousands, and though his garrison was small, he believed the walls would hold. He had food enough for days, and the fortress was designed to withstand sieges, but what it had not been built to withstand was the fury of a people with nothing left to lose. As shouts rose from the crowd and muskets cracked in the morning light, Launay hesitated. Between duty and dread, between command and chaos, he found himself alone. The king was miles away, the ministers were silent, and the streets of Paris were speaking a language that could not be ignored. Among the crowd was a young blacksmith named Jacques Moreau. His hands were thick with calluses, his arms strong from years at the forge, but his eyes were gentle, marked by the death of his sister who had wasted. Away without a doctor to treat her, Jacques had never been a man of politics, but as he looked at the Bastille, he saw the sickness that had stolen her life. He raised a hammer once used to shape iron, and now raised to shatter chains. Around him, the people surged forward, their cries no longer fragmented but united as one. Freedom for the people, justice for the poor. Down with tyranny. Gunfire broke the air, tearing through bodies and sending screams across the plaza, but the crowd pressed on. using carts, ladders, and sheer will to storm the gates. The drawbridge groaned under the weight of their fury, and after hours of battle, after blood had been spilled and tears shed, the gate finally gave way, Launay realizing defeat was near tried. To negotiate, but the people no longer trusted words. They stormed the fortress room by room, freeing the handful of prisoners and dragging the governor to the square. That night, the Bastille no longer cast its shadow over Paris. Its towers stood, broken, its gates shattered, and its silence replaced by the voices of a people reborn. They had done the unthinkable. They had brought down the symbol of their oppression, not with armies or kings, but with courage and unity. And though the cost had been great, the price had been paid, not in vain. Word of the Bastille's fall spread like wildfire across Paris, igniting not only the hopes of the poor, but the fears of the privileged, as the city trembled under the weight of its own awakening. The king and his ministers remained insulated in Versailles, debating reforms in marble halls, while the real revolution brewed in the bloodied streets below. For the first time in centuries, the people felt their own power. They had stormed a fortress. They had faced musket fire and lived, and now they demanded more. No longer content with whispers of change, they called for justice, transparency, and representation in every tavern, in every market, in every home. Voices rose together, questioning the divine right of kings and imagining a new France born not of titles, but of equality and purpose. In the districts surrounding the Bastille, bonfires lit the night, and from them came songs of freedom echoing between crumbling walls that had once been too afraid to speak among the crowd. That night stood a woman named Lucille Renard, a seamstress who had spent her life mending the garments of nobles who never remembered her name, but now with her hands still stained by thread and dye, she held her child close and whispered stories of hope, of a future where her daughter would not bow before men simply because they were born into wealth. Lucille had lost her husband to a work accident in a factory, with no safety, no justice, no compensation. Just another nameless poor man in the kingdom's endless ledger of neglect. But as she stood in the glowing warmth of revolution, she knew his death would no longer be part of a forgotten statistic. It would be a thread in the great tapestry of change. The National Assembly, made up of men from the Third Estate, had begun to assert itself more boldly, claiming the right to represent the people, rather than the nobility and clergy who had long dictated the laws. The newly declared National Constituent Assembly now drafted what would become the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, an audacious document that promised liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It was not perfect. Women were left out, and the chains of slavery still clung to the colonies, but it was a spark, and for many it was the first time the word citizen had meant more than a tax-paying peasant in the rural countryside, far from the stormed prison and echoing cries of Paris farmers, paused in their fields to listen to travelers relay tales of revolution. At first disbelief reigned. How could a fortress like the Bastille fall to common people? How could a king be challenged by shoemakers and barbers and widows? Yet slowly the truth took root, and in village after village the feudal system began to unravel. Serfs questioned their lords, villages held their own meetings, and old documents binding men to centuries of servitude were burned in public squares back in Paris. New leaders emerged not from palaces or universities, but from the heart of the mob. Georges Danton, Maximilien Robespierre, and others who had once merely watched now stepped into the spotlight, calling for deeper reforms and stricter action. They spoke not only to the crowd, but for it. And while their words inspired, they also stirred the growing storm of radicalism as power shifted from crown to people. Those who had once begged for bread now demanded a voice in government and protection from exploitation. And for many, especially those like Jacques, who had fought at the Bastille, justice meant more than words. It meant accountability. Nobles who had ordered beatings, unpaid labor, or worse, now faced angry questions from those they once dismissed. The symbols of royalty began to vanish. Street names changed, royal crests were torn down. Statues of kings were dragged through mud and spat on not out of hatred alone, but out of a need to erase the reminder of chains and declare the birth of a people who would no longer kneel, but with change came fear. The aristocracy watched in horror as their way of life began to crumble. The press, which had once been muzzled, now exploded with pamphlets, songs, poems, and fiery declarations. Some urged restraint, others called for blood. Rumors flew through the salons and courtyards of an aristocratic conspiracy to crush the revolution. Foreign armies were said to be gathering. The king's secret letters suggested betrayal, and among the people, paranoia spread like a sickness. At the heart of this unease was the king himself. Louis XVI tried to maintain calm, but his inaction, his whispers to foreign allies, and his refusal to accept the full authority of the Assembly made him a symbol of resistance to the revolution and a target of growing wrath, while Marie Antoinette, cloistered in luxury, remained the queen of mockery, called Madame Deficit, by a population she refused to see when the king attempted to flee the country. In what would become known as the flight to Varennes, the trust that some had clung to shattered entirely. He was no longer a misguided monarch, but a traitor to the people, and from that moment forward the idea of a constitutional monarchy faded, replaced by calls for a republic in the neighborhoods of Paris, like the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and the Marais. Ordinary men and women prepared for what felt like an inevitable reckoning. They drilled with pikes, practiced formations, learned the language of revolution, not from books but from blood and necessity, for Lucille, for Jacques, and for the thousands like them who had never held power in their lives. Every new sunrise brought both hope and dread: hope that the nation might be reborn, and dread that the old world would not go quietly as the Bastille's stones were carted away one by one to be sold as souvenirs or reused in the construction of new buildings. So too were the old ideas being broken down and reassembled. But unlike stone, ideas could not be easily shaped. They resisted, splintered, evolved, and burned, and from their ashes rose both angels and demons as Paris celebrated its victory. It also braced for the storm ahead, for the fall of the Bastille was not an end, but a beginning. The curtain had lifted. The people had found their voice. And now France stood on the edge of transformation, suspended between dream and nightmare, liberty and vengeance, justice and terror. The months that followed the fall of the Bastille were a whirlwind of declarations, celebrations, and dangerous uncertainty as the people of France stood on the cusp of rewriting their destiny, yet found themselves without a map. The National Assembly continued its work in Versailles, hammering out articles of reform, while in Paris the heartbeat of revolution grew louder and less predictable. The streets, once alive with joy and song, now crackled with tension and suspicion. The seeds of liberty had been planted, but no one knew what might grow from them. In the working-class districts, barricades began to appear not out of necessity, but as symbols of readiness, of vigilance against a return to tyranny. Lucille Renard, now a respected voice in her quarter, had begun to host informal gatherings where men and women discussed the meaning of citizenship, the nature of freedom, and the uncertain role of the church in their lives. For centuries, the clergy had preached obedience, loyalty, and divine hierarchy, but now many priests found their churches half empty, their congregations wary, and the crosses above their pulpits seen as remnants of control rather than comfort. Even among the faithful, debates raged about the civil constitution of the clergy passed by the Assembly, which effectively placed the church under state authority, forcing priests to swear loyalty to the nation rather than the Pope. This law split communities, families, and consciences, as some embraced the idea of national unity, while others feared divine punishment for defying tradition. Jacques, who once stormed the Bastille with nothing but a blacksmith's hammer, now wore the tricolor cockade with pride and patrolled his neighborhood as part of the new National Guard tasked with maintaining order and defending the revolution from its enemies within. He had never thought of himself as a soldier, but the weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders as he watched neighbors accuse neighbors of royalist sympathies and saw the same. Mobs that once rose against tyranny now threatened those who disagreed with the fevered pace of change. He understood the necessity of vigilance, but feared the loss of compassion one evening. While walking home from his shift, Jacques found a crowd gathered outside the home of a former nobleman who had renounced his title and pledged loyalty to the Republic. Yet whispers of hidden gold and secret letters had turned suspicion into fury. The mob demanded entry, accused him of betrayal, and would have torn down the door had Jacques not stepped forward with arms raised and voice calm enough to stall their rage. He reminded them that justice without truth was another form of tyranny, and that the revolution must not become what it sought. To destroy the crowd dispersed reluctantly, some grumbling, others ashamed, and the nobleman thanked Jacques with tears in his eyes. But such moments of mercy were rare, and growing rarer in the assembly. New factions were rising. The moderate Feuillants, who sought a constitutional monarchy, found themselves at odds with the radical Jacobins, who envisioned a republic governed by the people not merely in name, but in blood and sacrifice. Robespierre, once a quiet lawyer, now spoke with thunder, proclaiming, "That virtue must be wedded to terror if liberty were to survive." His words stirred both awe and fear, as many began to wonder whether the revolution they had fought for was slipping into the hands of men who cared more for ideology than humanity. In the countryside, noble estates were torched, documents of feudal dues burned, and statues of monarchs pulled from pedestals and left to crumble among the ash. The Great Fear, as it came to be known, spread across the provinces as rumors of counter-revolutionary plots, foreign invasions, and royalist uprisings gripped the hearts of the peasantry who had waited too long for justice, and now took it with their own hands. Some who had never spoken against the crown now found themselves hunted, labeled as enemies of the people, and dragged before local councils. Where trials were short and verdicts often fatal in Paris, the situation grew more unstable. As food shortages returned, prices soared, and bread lines lengthened. What had once been seen as a glorious uprising now bore the signs of a city unraveling with every empty shop, every shouted accusation, every pounding of drums and boots. The fragile dream of unity cracked a little more. Lucille remained hopeful, but she no longer smiled as often. Her daughter, once bright-eyed and curious, now clung to her side with questions about the soldiers on the street and the shouts in the night. "What does liberty mean, maman?" she once asked, and Lucille, unsure of the answer, simply held her tighter, knowing only that freedom must not cost the soul of the people who seek it. The king, now confined to the Tuileries palace, was a prisoner in all but name. Watched by guards and stripped of his divine aura, he sat with his family behind tall gates and waited. For a fate he could no longer escape. His attempt to flee had sealed it. His hesitation had condemned him, and his silence had rendered him irrelevant to a movement that had surpassed him in force and passion. As summer gave way to autumn, the question of what to do with the monarchy loomed large over every conversation. Some called for exile, others for trial. But among the Jacobins, voices grew louder for execution. The idea of a republic not just in word, but in form, became more than a dream, became a demand, and as the new year approached, a vote would be held, a decision made that would change the course of France forever. But before that, a storm was coming, one that would test the hearts and principles of every man, woman, and child who had dared to believe in liberty and dared to fight for it. The bitter winds of 1793 continued to cut through the streets of Paris as the Republic descended deeper into the grip of fear, suspicion, and bloodshed. The dream of liberty had soured into a nightmare of executions and accusations. The guillotine no longer inspired awe, but dread its blade, falling day and night under the shadow of what was once called justice. The death of Louis XVI had marked the point of no return, and with it the Jacobins led by Robespierre claimed full control, preaching that virtue could only survive when cleansed by terror. Those who questioned the logic were branded traitors. Even those who had marched shoulder to shoulder during the storming of the Bastille were now dragged into prisons or directly to the scaffold. The law of suspects opened the floodgates to paranoia, and thousands were arrested without trial for mere rumors or associations. The revolution had begun with chants of freedom and unity, but now only silence and fear walked the alleys where children once played Jacques, who had raised his hammer against. The Bastille watched with growing horror as the very spirit he had fought for was devoured by its own leaders. Once he believed in the need for justice in the fall of the monarchy and the empowerment of the people, but now he saw that unchecked. Power, no matter its origin, turned against the very ideals it claimed to uphold. Lucille Renard, who had sewn flags of the Republic and whispered stories of hope to her daughter, now avoided her own window, too afraid to look out, too cautious to speak. To neighbors, even her church had gone quiet. The bells stopped ringing, the pews stayed empty, and the priests disappeared one by one. They were told to trust the revolution, to believe in the process. But trust was a word no longer spoken openly. Jacques continued to serve in the National Guard, but the pride he once felt had rotted into dread. Every order he followed seemed to draw blood. Every patrol he walked exposed him to more pain, more loss, more disillusionment. As the months dragged on, even Robespierre began to lose the aura of control that once clung to him. His former allies turned skeptical, then hostile. His speeches, once met with thunderous applause, were now received with nervous silence in the convention. Whispers turned into mutiny as political enemies from all sides realized that Robespierre's fall was the only way to stop the killing and reclaim the revolution from the abyss. In July 1794, Robespierre was arrested and executed, his fall cheered by a city that had once worshipped him as the incorruptible. And with his death, the reign of terror began to fade. The guillotine no longer cast its long shadow across the square. The lists stopped growing. The prisons slowly emptied, and the mood of Paris began to shift again. But the scars ran deep for every family like Lucille's who had survived. There were 10 more who mourned for every man like Jacques, who had kept his soul intact. There were dozens who had become numb to sorrow. The dream of liberty had not died, but it had been broken, reshaped by fire and blood, and now the people of France were left to rebuild not just their streets and homes, but their belief in each other, in the possibility of a nation governed not by fear or lineage, but by justice and equality. Over the next few years, France saw the rise of new leaders, new constitutions, and eventually Napoleon Bonaparte, whose promise of stability seduced a weary population. The Republic remained, but in form more than in spirit. The ideals of 1789 lived on in books, in songs, in faded murals. But the unity of those early revolutionary days never fully returned. Yet even so, even through the betrayals, the terror, the loss, something had changed. Forever the Bastille was gone, its stones scattered, its gates shattered, its symbol dead, and in its place stood a people who had tasted their own power, who had glimpsed the terrifying beauty of freedom and felt the cost of keeping it. Lucille grew. Older, her daughter now a teacher, passing on stories not of kings and queens but of citizens and courage. Jacques returned to his forge, not as a soldier, not as a revolutionary, but as a man who had lived through history and chosen to believe that, no matter how dark the night, the light of justice could still be lit again across France. Monuments were built, names were honored, books were written. And each year, on the 14th of July, the people remembered not just the fall of a prison, but the rise of a voice, a moment when the ordinary dared to change the world. And for all its pain, all its failures, all its blood, that voice had not been silenced. It had only just begun.